Module 16 is an introduction to network security fundamentals. And we'll be looking at different security threats, vulnerabilities, and mitigation techniques. Attacks on a network can be devastating and can result in a loss of time and money due to damage or theft of important information or assets. Intruders can gain access to a network through software vulnerabilities, hardware attacks, or through guessing someone's username and password. Intruders who gain access by modifying software or exploiting software vulnerabilities are called threat actors. After a threat actor gains access to the network, four types of threats may arise: information theft, data loss and manipulation, identity theft, and disruption of service. Vulnerability is the degree of weakness in a network or a device. Some degree of vulnerability is inherent in routers, switches, desktops, servers, and even security devices. Typically, the devices under attack are the endpoints, such as servers and desktop computers. There are three primary vulnerabilities or weaknesses. Technology vulnerabilities might include TCP/IP protocol weaknesses, operating system weaknesses, and network equipment weaknesses. Configuration vulnerabilities might include unsecure user accounts, system accounts with easily guessed passwords, misconfigured internet services, unsecure default settings, and misconfigured network equipment. Security policy vulnerabilities might include a lack of a written security policy, politics, lack of authentication continuity, logical access controls not applied, software and hardware installation and changes not following policy, and a non-existent disaster recovery plan. All three of these sources of vulnerabilities can leave a network or device open to various attacks, including malicious code attacks and network attacks. If network resources can be physically compromised, a threat actor can deny the use of network resources. The four classes of physical threats are as follows. Hardware threats. This includes physical damage to servers, routers, switches, cabling plant, and workstations. Environmental threats. This includes temperature extremes, too hot or too cold, or humidity extremes, too wet or too dry. Electrical threats. This includes voltage spikes, insufficient supply voltage, brownouts, unconditioned power, noise, and total power loss. And maintenance threats. This includes poor handling of key electrical components, electrostatic discharge, lack of critical spare parts, poor cabling, and poor labeling. A good plan for physical security must be created and implemented to address these issues. Let's turn our attention to some common network attacks. Malware is short for malicious software. It is code or software specifically designed to damage, disrupt, steal, or inflict bad or illegitimate action on data, hosts, or networks. The following are types of malware. Viruses. A computer virus is a type of malware that propagates by inserting a copy of itself into and becoming part of another program. It spreads from one computer to another, leaving infections as it travels. Worms. Computer worms are similar to viruses in that they replicate functional copies of themselves and can cause the same type of damage. In contrast to viruses, which require the spreading of an infected host file, Worms are standalone software and do not require a host program or human help to propagate. Finally, Trojan horses. It is a harmful piece of software that looks legitimate. Unlike viruses and worms, Trojan horses do not reproduce by infecting other files. They self-replicate. Trojan horses must spread through user interactions, such as opening an email attachment or downloading and running a file from the internet. Reconnaissance attacks. In addition to malicious code attacks, it is also possible for networks to fall prey to various network attacks. Network attacks can be classified into three major categories. Reconnaissance attacks, the discovery and mapping of systems, services, and vulnerabilities. Access attacks, the unauthorized manipulation of data, system access, or user privileges. And finally, denial of service, the disabling or corruption of networks, systems, or services. For reconnaissance attacks, external threat actors can use internet tools such as the NSLOOKUP or WHOIS utilities to easily determine the IP address space assigned to a given corporation or entity. After the IP address space is determined, a threat actor can then ping the publicly available IP addresses to identify the addresses that are active. Access attacks exploit known vulnerabilities in authentication services, FTP services, and web services to gain entry to web accounts, confidential databases, and other sensitive information. Access attacks can be classified into four types. Password attacks, implemented using brute force, Trojan horse, and packet sniffers, as well as different kinds of dictionary attacks that may be employed. Trust exploitation. A threat actor uses unauthorized privileges to gain access to a system, possibly compromising the target. Port redirection. A threat actor uses a compromised system as a base for attacks against other targets. For example, a threat actor using SSH port 22 to connect to a compromised host A. Host A is trusted by host B, and therefore the threat actor can use Telnet port 23 to access it. Man in the middle. The threat actor's position between two legitimate entities in order to read or modify the data that passes between the two parties. Denial of service attacks are the most publicized form of attack and among the most difficult to eliminate. However, because of their ease of implementation and potentially significant damage, DOS attacks deserve special attention from security administrators. Denial of service attacks take many forms. Ultimately, they prevent authorized people from using a service by consuming its resources. To help prevent DOS attacks, it is important to stay up to date with the latest security updates for operating systems and applications. DOS attacks are a major risk because they interrupt communication and cause significant loss of time and money. These attacks are relatively simple to conduct, even by an unskilled threat actor. A distributed denial of service attack is similar to a denial of service attack, but it originates from multiple coordinated sources. For example, a threat actor builds a network of infected hosts, known as zombies or bots. A network of zombies is called a botnet. The threat actor uses a command and control program to instruct the botnet of zombies to carry out DDoS attacks. The curriculum has a short PDF lab that you can that'll direct you to the SANS website for system administration and networking and security professionals, and will have you navigate the website and look at the resources on that particular website. That's a useful activity if you have the time. Let's turn our attention to network attack mitigation techniques. To mitigate network attacks, you must first secure devices including routers, switches, servers, and hosts. Most organizations employ a defense in depth approach, known as a layered approach to security. This requires a combination of network devices and services working in tandem with one another. Several security devices and services are implemented to protect an organization's users and assets against TCP/IP threats. Those include virtual private network connections for secure remote access, firewalls to control access between different networks and subnetworks. The adaptive security appliance from Cisco is an example of a firewall, network firewall. Intrusion prevention services allow you to monitor network traffic and act on that. So possibly changing firewall rules to mitigate an ongoing network attack. Email security appliances and web security appliances are important aspects in securing networks nowadays. They act as a proxy for the hosts on your network and will filter email, for example, and look in the email for malware that's been attached to an email as an attachment, or links possibly to known websites that are hosting malware. And web security appliances again act as a proxy between your internal hosts as they go out and browse the internet. That traffic will go to the intermediary web security appliance, and that will inspect the web content for malicious scripts and bad links and so on, before delivering that content to your internal network hosts. And AAA services. We'll look at AAA services in more depth as we go, but that's for validating user access to different resources on the network. And keeping backups. Proper backup procedures cannot be the value of that cannot be understated. Backing up device configurations and data is one of the most effective ways of protecting against data loss. Backups should be performed on a regular basis as identified in your corporation's security policy. Data backups are usually stored off-site to protect the backup media if anything happens to the main facility. And the main considerations when backing things up is how often are we going to back up, and what data are we going to back up in those intervals. So if you have a large amount of data, a full backup can take a long time to do and can be very process or network intensive procedure. So you may do that on a daily or weekly basis, and then you'll have partial backups that occur more frequently. And those partial backups will consist of the changes that have been made to the data files since the last full backup. So there are different strategies for doing incremental backups. So once you determine the frequency of your backup procedures and what you're backing up, you'll need to identify your storage mechanism. Are you backing up to tape, backing up to hard drives? What kind of media and where is that media being stored for security purposes. In the event of a fire or flood or complete damage to that data on the primary site, that location may completely burn down. So it'd be important that not only are you backing up, but backing up to an off-site storage location. And with the cloud, that has become a fairly cost-effective approach to backing up to the cloud. For example, Amazon Web Services has backup procedures that you can back to their storage network out on their data centers. And validation, making sure that the backup has been stored, that the restoration procedure works properly, and that that data is encrypted using strong passwords. As new malware is released, enterprises need to keep current with the latest versions of antivirus software. So they need to ensure that antivirus or anti-malware software is being updated, and they need to patch their operating systems. So the most effective way to mitigate a worm attack is to download security updates from the operating system vendor, such as Apple or Microsoft, and to patch all the vulnerable systems. One solution to the management of critical security patches is to make sure that your end devices are set to automatically download updates. And this includes not just your anti-malware software and your operating system, but also your third-party software. All the applications you're utilizing have vulnerabilities as well and need to be updated and patched. AAA services are the authentication, authorization, and accounting network security services that provide the primary framework to set up access control on network devices. AAA is a way to control who is permitted to access a network. Who are you? In other words, the authentication portion. What actions they perform while accessing the network. That's the authorization mechanism. And making a record of what was done while they're there. That's the accounting feature. The concept of AAA is similar to the use of a credit card. The credit card identifies who can use it, how much that user can spend, and keeps account of what items the user spent the money on. Network firewalls reside between two or more networks, control the traffic between them, and help prevent unauthorized access. Typically, we see firewalls between your corporate network and the internet, for sure. But these firewalls may be placed in different portions of your network to control access to different sensitive hosts or segments on your network. A firewall could allow outside users controlled access to specific services. For example, servers accessible to outside users are usually located on a special network referred to as the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. The DMZ enables a network administrator to apply specific policies for hosts connected to that network. So we typically want to keep our trusted internal network as secure as possible. If we are going to provide data or services to the public internet or to partners, business partners, or clients, then we'll put that on a secured subnet that's separate from our internal corporate network and monitor access closely to those resources because they'll be the first to be attacked. There are different types of firewalls, and these firewall products come packaged in various forms. These products use different techniques for determining what will be permitted or denied access to a network. They include the following: packet filtering, so inspecting the TCP/IP traffic and allowing or denying access based on IP or MAC addresses. Application filtering allows the firewall to prevent or allow access by specific application types based on TCP or UDP port numbers in the TCP/IP traffic flow. URL filtering prevents or allows access to websites based on specific uniform resource locators or keywords in the web content or web searches. And stateful packet inspection. Incoming packets must be legitimate responses to requests from internal hosts. Unsolicited packets from the internet, for example, are blocked unless permitted specifically by the firewall rule set. SPI, or stateful packet inspection, can also include the capability to recognize and filter out specific types of attacks, such as denial of service attacks. So as inside hosts on your corporate network on the inside, their traffic is allowed to pass through the firewall and go out to less trusted networks like the internet. So here's your internal network. And going out to the outside world or the internet here, that traffic is allowed, to pass out relatively easy. And as the traffic, the return traffic comes back, the firewall is inspecting it against a state table that as the outbound traffic goes out, that outbound conversation's logged in a state table, and when the return traffic comes back, it's matched against the parameters of an existing outbound conversation that started from the inside out. And if there is none in the state table, that traffic is typically blocked. Endpoint security is another important aspect of mitigating network attacks. An endpoint or host is an individual computer system or device that acts as a network client. Common endpoints are laptops, desktops, servers, smartphones, and tablets. Securing endpoint devices is one of the most challenging jobs of a network administrator because it involves human nature. A company must have well-documented policies in place, and employees must be aware of these rules. Employees need to be trained on proper use of the network. Policies often include the use of antivirus software and host intrusion prevention. Most or more comprehensive endpoint security solutions rely on network access control. So before the host is allowed to access the network, it is checked by the network access control appliance and make sure that it has for its operating system has downloaded and installed all the most recent patches, and it's inspected before it's allowed to attach and participate on the network. The last topic of Module 16 looks at some of the commands we can do in the Cisco IOS to help secure our Cisco routers and switches. The Cisco Auto Secure command is one of these such features in the operating system that can be used. The security settings are set to the default values when a new operating system is installed on a device. In most cases, this level of security is inadequate. For Cisco routers, the Cisco Auto Secure feature can be used to assist securing the system. In addition, there are some simple steps that should be taken that apply to most operating systems, not just including the Cisco iOS. That is, default usernames and passwords should be changed immediately. Access to system resources should be restricted to only the individuals that are authorized to use those resources. That's called the principle of least privilege. Any unnecessary services and applications should be turned off and uninstalled when possible. And often, devices shipped from the manufacturer that have been sitting in a warehouse for a period of time and do not have the most up-to-date patches installed. So it's important to update any software and install any security patches prior to implementation, prior to putting it out onto the live network. To protect network devices, it's important to use strong passwords. And here are some standard guidelines to follow when dealing with passwords. Use a password length of at least 8 characters, preferably 10 or more. Make passwords complex. Include a mixture of upper and lowercase letters, numbers, symbols, and spaces if allowed. Avoid passwords based on repetition, common dictionary words, letter or number sequences, usernames, relative or pet names, biographical information such as birth dates, ID numbers, ancestor names, or any other easily identifiable pieces of information. A good practice is to deliberately misspell a password. For example, instead of using Smith, maybe substitute the I for a Y or a 5 for an S, and maybe put in a mixture of uppercase when it's in the mix of the characters, or substitute a letter for a number, possibly, like I, the number 1 for the letter I, and the number 5 for the letter S. Change passwords often. If a password is unknowingly compromised, the window of opportunity for the threat actor to use the password is limited. And do not write passwords down or leave them in obvious places, such as on the desk or underneath the keyboard or or taped onto the monitor. On Cisco routers, leading spaces are ignored for passwords, but spaces after the first character are not. Therefore, one method to create a strong password is to use the space bar and create a phrase made of many words. This is called a passphrase instead of a password. And a passphrase is often easier to remember than a simple password. It's also longer and harder to guess. So let's just take a look at an example of creating a fairly complex passphrase, and you may think of something like the big bad wolf, for example. That would be an example of a passphrase. You may want to incorporate, this has upper and lowercase letters, but you could easily incorporate special characters by appending one to the beginning and end. Maybe use the @ symbol in place of the letter A, or the exclamation in place of the letter I. So you can substitute maybe some vowels and put in special characters, or maybe numeric ones, like substitute 0 in place of O. And so you see, this is a fairly complex password. If I copy this password, and it's fairly easy to remember, if I just kind of keep my what letters I'm substituting, characters I'm substituting in place of letters, I'm going to bring up a website here It's a password checker. Now, you wouldn't want to use any passwords you're really considering using, but come up with a scheme. You can test some sample passwords and get an idea. For example, I'm going to go ahead and paste in the Big Bad Wolf example I just gave you, and it lets you know, hey, this is going to take 10,000 plus centuries to brute force password attack this, to crack that password on a normal computer, not on by a supercomputer, but on a normal computer, home computer would take that much time. Now let me say I'm using a password of my dog's name, Charlie. And you'll see the password checker says, oh, there are widely used combinations here. So this password is susceptible to dictionary attacks, where commonly used words may be in the dictionary and they'll be tried, successively. So that's not a good password. So you can play around with creating strong pass phrases. This is by Kaspersky. They're a security company, but there are other free ones out there. And again, don't use any passwords that you currently are using, just out of safety for maintaining the integrity of your passwords. But you can use it to play around with and schemes of how you can generate solid passwords. All right, let me get back to our lecture here. Okay, and as far as additional password security in terms of Cisco routers and switches, when you password protect different features like the virtual teletype lines that we did earlier in our semester, virtual teletype lines like our Telnet or SSH access, when we put in the password, this would get stored in clear text. So the service password -encryption command will ensure that the passwords are encrypted on your system. So they won't be displayed in clear text. Another helpful password related command is to set a minimum acceptable password length. So if you wanted to set the minimum password length, enforce that people would have to use at least 8 characters in generating a password on this router, you use this security password min-length command, and 8 for 8 characters. To deter brute force password guessing attacks, you can use the login block-4 command, and this will say how many seconds you're going to block. In this case, it would be 2 minutes, 120 seconds, after receiving 3 invalid attempts within a 60-second period. So if the router receives 3 invalid login attempts within a minute, it will block that login service for 2 minutes, and then that would slow down a brute force attack. And you can alter any of these parameters in the router for this particular command. You can bump it up or down, however your policy is for your company or organization. And you can also disable your terminal session after a period of inactivity. So if you want, you can set an exec timeout feature that will deactivate or disable the current session after a period of inactivity. And here the transport input command is used if you want to only allow SSH connections to your router for remote management. This ensures an encrypted conversation whereas allowing for telnet, if I were to say transport input telnet and include telnet in the command, that'll allow clear text conversations for remote administration. And if there was someone capturing the packets, they would be able to decipher the conversation. So this is much like ensuring that you're using HTTPS instead of HTTP when web browsing. All right. And in ensuring we use Secure Shell for our remote management, there's some steps that have to be configured on the router or switch to ensure this happens. So your device will have a host name. You have to have a host name configured for your device. You'll set up a domain name, an IP domain name, and that'll be used, the combination of the host name and the domain name will be used by the router to store the certificate that gets generated. When you generate the key to encrypt the SSH traffic, that certificate will be stored under a file name named hostname.domainname. And that's where it'll store that certificate. The crypto key generate command is used to generate the RSA key, and you can specify the modulus. The longer the bits used, the more bits used, the more secure the key will be. And you'll need to configure a user account that'll be used to log in. So you'll create a local user on that device that'll be used to log in. And instead of just requiring a password for the virtual teletype lines to access by saying, password and a password and saying login, we will change that to just saying login local. And that'll tell the router to don't just authenticate them based on a password when they try to telnet or SSH in this case SSH. You'll ask for a username and a password, and so that's much more effective. And again, the transport input command, by just specifying SSH, you won't allow telnet, more insecure telnet connections to occur. And finally, we can disable unused services, and that'll happen with the auto secure command. That'll disable a lot of different typically unused or older protocols or services. If you utilize in the newer iOS, you can use the show IP ports all command, and that will identify the ports that are open and that the router's listening on. Now that's in the new iOS XE operating systems. And older iOSs, you can use the show control-plane host open-ports command. Now, unfortunately, this command is not available in Packet Tracer. Packet Tracer does not have these commands programmed into the simulator, but those are the commands you'd use on a real router. So let's go ahead and set up a router with some of these commands and see how they operate in Packet Tracer. To demonstrate some of the device security commands covered in this topic, I'm going to use the classroom pod configuration.pkt file found in your Blackboard Classroom Supplementary Materials folder. And I'm going to open up Router A's command line interface and bring up a command line interface on Router A. Here we can utilize the auto secure command. if we want to go through a wizard that will walk you through doing some security enhancements to the system. So the auto secure command first identifies or asks if your router is connected to the internet. And, obviously it's not in this example, but I'm going to say yes. And it'll ask how many of interfaces of the router face the internet. And I'm going to choose the default answer 1 by hitting enter. And then picking the particular interface that connects to the internet. Now I'm going to choose serial 020 just for demonstration purposes. And once you do that, you'll notice how the router is going to then start disabling older, typically unused protocols, and it will then enable the service password encryption that'll encrypt any clear text passwords being stored on the router, and it disables some protocols that may pose security concerns like CDP or the web server service or the finger service or gratuitous ARP services. And then it'll walk through some other basic security settings like setting a banner message, changing the enable secret passwords, and then potentially, if you choose to, enabling a stateful packet filter or firewall service on the interface configured for the internet. So it will identify, based on your answer, which interface you said was connected to the internet, and then the other interfaces will be deemed as internal interfaces, and it'll auto-configure a basic firewall for you. Now, I'm not going to walk through the entire auto-secure procedure, but that's one method of helping secure your system initially. I'm going to do a Control-C to break out of that dialog. Routers A and B and the other hosts on the network in this classroom pod configuration file have been pre-configured to work. And so they all have basic configurations on them. I'm going to walk through a few of the commands that we utilized in our session here, this last topic, in securing the router manually, some of those other settings. So the first thing I'm going to do is enter global configuration mode by giving a configure terminal or config space T for short. And to enable the service password encryption, I would say service password dash encryption. That'll encrypt any clear text passwords. And I just abbreviated the command there just for quicker typing. And now to also enforce a minimum password length, I'm going to use the security password, and I'm going to do a question mark. Remember, you have your help feature, min-length, and set a minimum length. And now you can set that minimum length shorter, but I'm going to go ahead and set it as an 8-character password that it will request all new passwords to meet that minimum password length. And you'll notice if I go to set a password and I say enable secret to change my enable secret password, let's say I go and try to use a shorter password length like Cisco, for example. The system will let me know, hey, future passwords have to meet this password complexity requirement. Another password security setting we can do is do the login block -4 command, and you can set the period time in seconds that it will block further login attempts for. So let's say I want to block it for 3 minutes. That would be 180 seconds. And you can set your maximum attempts here, failed attempts. So let's say that if they have 4 failed attempts within 2 minutes. Okay, so the effect of this command would be that if someone attempts to log in and has 4 invalid attempts within 2 minutes, the system will lock any further login attempts for 3 minutes. And all of those parameters are configurable to what you'd like to use. All right. Well, let's also walk through the process of setting up the system for SSH secure shell access. And so the first thing is, again, your system needs a host name. Now it is already pre-configured with a host name of router A, but let's go ahead and just change that. We're going to say host name. Oh, and maybe before we do this, let me go ahead and do a crypto key zeroize RSA. And what that'll do is remove any previously generated keys. So I'm going to say yes to that I do wish to remove any keys. So this router was pre-configured, and so I just removed any previously generated keys. So as we go through this process, it'll generate a fresh key. All right, so I'm going to change the host name just so that you see that process. Again, as part of the generating the key used for secure shell access, you do have to have a host name, and I'm going to change the host name to just RA instead of router A, and you see the prompt change. The next thing in configuring secure shell access is that you need a domain name. So I'm going to say IP domain-name and give it a domain name of, let's make up something here. Let's just go with irsc.edu, for example. All right, and now the certificate will be stored under the file name ra.irsc.edu. And to generate that certificate, let's walk through the generation of the certificate. We'll do a crypto key generate RSA, and I'm going to do the question mark. I'm going to say general dash keys modulus, and the size of how many bits you want in the modulus. So the bit string length, let's go with 1024. That's plenty long. And you see that SSH, the secure shell, has been enabled, version 2, and that's ready to go with that key. If I wanted to view that key that was just generated, I'm going to say exit, and I'm going to say show crypto key RSA. That stands for Ribis Shamir Edelman. And let's see if, your public key, my pub key Whoops, and it takes another argument. There's the RSA. Okay, and here you see the keys here. We have RA, this key pair was generated, and I've got the key name is ra.irsc.edu, and here's the key data, and the date and time are wrong on the router here in Packet Tracer, so ignore that. All right, and so there's how you generate the key for secure shell access. We will go ahead and go back into global configuration mode and set up a user account that'll be used to access the system. So I'm going to say Homer Simpson, so H Simpson, and set a Homer's privilege level at, say, 15, and instead of using just a basic password, I'm going to ensure that it's the secret password, so it's encrypted, strongly encrypted on the system, and a password for Homer. So again, you'd use the password complexity requirements, and so you generate a passphrase, something like the big bad wolf here that I have highlighted here, or maybe this one, a little red Corvette with dollar signs incorporated. I'm going to go ahead, whoops, and utilize that. There, and make sure you don't get a space after that, because that would become part of the password. All right, and so there's my user account that'll be used when making a secure shell connection for remote management. I've created the certificate and stored it under ra.irsc.edu. Let's go ahead and go to our line VTY 04 or 015 space between there. This will allow for 5 concurrent sessions, management connections, and we can limit access to just the secure shell protocol by saying transport input SSH, and then telnet sessions will no longer be allowed. Those happen in clear text and are insecure. So this is a good way of limiting that. And then also, let's set the exec timeout for that. So let's give an exec dash timeout. I'm going to do a question mark in minutes. Let's say after 2 minutes here. And then, that will be your two timeout values of your time of inactivity. So let's say I have 3 minutes inactivity or 30 total minutes that the session, if it lasts that long, it'll just automatically, that remote connection will drop. Okay, and that should take care of that. Let's see, what else would we like to do? And then we'll make sure that the system asks for a username and a password when logging in. So we're going to say login local. All right. Instead of setting just a password and saying login, this will validate them against the credentials we created. H Simpson with the password little red Corvette there. All right, and the router already has an IP address assigned and it's working, so everything in terms of that is already going on. Let's just double check the ability for computer A to make that secure shell connection to router A. So we're going to go to the desktop here. And down below, we could use a command line, or we can use the built-in Telnet SSH service. And we'll use SSH as our protocol, and we'll go to router A's gigabit Ethernet port address at 192.168.1.1 with username hsimpson. And I'm going to go ahead and connect. And the password I'm going to provide is the little red Corvette. And you notice when you do paste that in or type that password in, it won't display any of the characters as you're typing. That's for security reasons, someone looking over your shoulder. And you see here we're logged into router A. And I can give a show run and view the running configuration on the router. And you see some of the settings that we had done in terms of our turning on the password encryption service, setting minimum password lengths, our brute force mitigation with the login block 4 command. And then down below you'll see some user accounts that had been created, as well as our configuration for our virtual teletype connections, and ensuring that we've got an exact timeout, and our login local, specifying that the router check the local database of accounts for validation, and our secure shell protocol should be used when making a connection. I'm going to exit our current session and just note that whoops, I should have said no here. Let me close that. Okay, and let me start a new telnet connection. And instead of using the secure shell, the encrypted conversation, let's go clear text using the less secure version of remote management, the telnet protocol. And you'll notice that the router does not allow telnet connections to occur. So that is part of our configuration with the transport input SSH command. So that's all working perfectly. And I don't believe there's anything else in terms of just what we had done for the few commands we had set in this last part of Module 16. So those are just some basic device hardening techniques you can use on the router to help secure remote management and access to the device, as well as blocking or disabling certain less used protocols and services. That takes care of Module 16.